In the early hours of a warm summer's morning on Sunday, the 31st of August, 1997, in the world's most romantic city, Paris, Diana, the Princess of Wales, tragically died in a horrific car crash. She was 36 years old. A family mourned, a nation wept. It seemed that the heart of the world stopped. Born at Park House, Sandringham, on July the 1st, 1961, Diana Frances Spencer was the third daughter of one of Britain's most historic families. Her birth is reported to have been greeted with disappointment by her father, who had longed for a boy. Her parents divorced when she was only 6. It was a lonely childhood, and one she later vowed her own children would never endure.
The Spencer household was not a happy one. And Di's childhood memories were often tearful. She would sit at the foot of the stairs with her 2 elder sisters, their hands cupped over their ears as their parents argued, and eventually she saw her mother walk from the front door of the Spencer home forever.
Having 2 parents at war does have a very traumatic effect on a child, and Diana was a particularly sensitive little girl. And I think it was an effect that would last with her through adult life, because even though when parents split up, they take great pains to say to a child, well, Mummy and Daddy still love you, the child still feels rejected and unloved, and they somehow blame themselves for why their parents are no longer with them. And of course, Diana and her brother and other 2 sisters were bounced between one parent and another. And maybe this kind of very insecure childhood stayed with Diana through all her life and had a very, very long-lasting effect. And it probably does explain an awful lot of Diana's continued feeling to want to be loved by people and to give a lot of love, because it was, I think, a throwback to this awfully sad childhood.
Diana went to boarding school in West Heath in Kent. She was not an academic girl, but excelled at sport. After a spell at a Swiss finishing school, at 17 she came back to London to look for work.
Diana was obviously a lovely girl, but she wasn't, to be fair, really equipped for any kind of high-powered career when she sort of left her varying nannying jobs and she left home. So I suppose because of her upbringing, the natural path to follow was working with children. Because of her own upsets and trauma, Diana had a very big insight into the mind of a child. She'd be the first one to pick out a child who looked lonely or unhappy. She'd be the first one to take a child's hand, and indeed children would follow her. She was at one time called the Pied Piper, and children would naturally go towards Diana. I think an interesting story is the fact that when she went to a friend's sports day, all the little girls won prizes except this one particular little child, and Diana noticed this and went over, and she created her own little ribbon and gave it to the little girl. And I think that's a very sort of telling insight into Diana's mind, that working with children, her love with children, and a love that later came out with her own sons, it was just inevitable, I think.
The Spencer and Windsor families had always been very close. Earl Spencer had been equerry to the Queen's father, George VI. And for their early years, the Spencers had lived on the Queen's Sandringham estate, so it was not unusual for the Queen to pop in for a cup of tea. Neither was it unusual when they moved to Althorp Hall in Northamptonshire for Prince Charles to drop by. In fact, he dropped by for a pheasant shoot. But bagging pheasants wasn't everything that was on his mind. He was actually looking to bag a bride.
Press rumours started to spread about the growing relationship between Charles and the young Diana Spencer. In 1980, Charles travelled to Zimbabwe for the independence ceremony and subsequent celebrations. Camilla Shand, now Parker Bowles, travelled as his official escort. Charles returned to woo the young Diana Spencer. Their romance became common knowledge that summer until their engagement was announced in February 1981, with Diana sporting a beautiful £28,000 diamond and sapphire engagement ring.
It was not a normal courtship by any modern standards. On the one hand, Prince Charles was under pressure to find a bride. From his parents, particularly, because they were anxious to see him married.
Charles, I think, had been sent out to catch a virgin. He'd been told it was time to settle down and start having children.
When Prince Charles decided he was going to marry Diana, The person who gave him her unqualified support and, in a way, permission was Camilla.
Even way back when Charles and Diana had just got engaged and the marriage was announced and the wedding presents started to come in, Princess Diana was absolutely devastated to find a package in Charles's private quarters which she thought was a wedding present to them both. And when she opened it, she found out, in fact, it was a present from Camilla, a private present, a personal present from Camilla to Charles. And I think then she perhaps got an inkling that she was up against a very difficult battle, that there was one woman who would always be in the shadow of their marriage.
They were married in July 1981, and to begin with, they were clearly happy. True, Charles may not have been the most conventional of romantic husbands, but the newlyweds were obviously in love, and it was only gradually to become clear that Charles would be upstaged by his beautiful wife. Diana became pregnant almost immediately. Prince William was born in June the next year, and it wasn't too long after the birth of William that commentators noticed that Diana was looking painfully thin.
Bulimia is an eating disorder. It's not unlike anorexia, which more people have heard of. Now, in anorexia, people starve themselves until they get really, really thin. Sometimes they, I'm afraid, starve themselves to death. In bulimia, it's rather harder to detect because quite often the woman concerned, and it is nearly always a woman, is of average weight. You wouldn't know anything was wrong by looking at her.
Charles's lack of rapport with his young wife became increasingly apparent. In 1982, Charles arrived for the Remembrance Day ceremony at the Royal Albert Hall alone, saying his wife was not well. Yet 5 minutes later, Diana arrived. Things went from bad to worse, with claims of suicide attempts.
Many things went wrong in the marriage. First of all, he fell out of love with her, or, as he'd never been in love with her, love evaporated.
They didn't like each other. It was quite clear they didn't like each other. There was no affection. They weren't tactile. There was no more touching. There were no more affectionate pats on the bottom from him to her. And they would arrive at places and split. And their backs to each other. And he, of course, felt this very strongly because he knew that she was upstaging him all the time.
The birth of their second child, Prince Harry, in 1984, kept up the pretense that all was well. In public, they mastered the art of putting on a united front, but behind the facade, things continued to deteriorate. Diana felt a stranger in her own home. In 1986, on a tour of Canada, proof positive emerged that the marriage was effectively over. In Vancouver, attending the Expo World Fair, the princess, clearly suffering from the effects of her bulimia, fainted in public.
Charles didn't rush to her side. He told her to pull herself together and to make herself presentable for that evening's festivities. Charles's utter frustration with his sham marriage came about 5 years into it. At that time, he'd given up the one love of his life, Camilla. He'd stayed with Diana for those 5 years. After 5 years, he went back to Camilla, and she became his comfort, his shoulder to cry on. I think it's significant that whenever Princess Diana visited Highgrove after an absence when Charles had been there, she would walk straight over to the telephone and press the redial button. At the end of the line was the Parker Bowles household on every occasion.
The abiding images of royalty in the late 80s are frivolous ones. On the ski slopes, at Ascot, at work and at play, the youngsters could be seen to be having a good time. But behind those frivolous images, the reality was very different. Diana has blamed the friendship of Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles for contributing to her unhappiness. But many royal watchers think that is not entirely fair. Diana herself was soon to reach a turning point in her life, on a skiing trip with Charles to Cloisters. After a photo call, she decided not to continue skiing, a decision which may have saved her life. Within hours, a close friend was dead and another critically injured.
Diana was friends with the wife. It was much more of a personal involvement for Charles than Diana. She was, of course, broken up by the tragedy because she saw a friend of hers who was pregnant losing her husband. And on that very same holiday, Catherine Soames had run off with another man who had been married 4 times. So there were other ramifications of the Cloisters holidays which have never gone into, which gave Diana also food for thought and for feeling that perhaps life was very unfair.
By the end of the 1980s, Charles and Diana were virtually living separate lives. It was only a matter of time before something dramatic occurred. What was remarkable was the nature of the event and how it came to the attention of the public. The effects were staggering and contributed to the crisis that was already facing the House of Windsor.
The Princess of Wales was spending the New Year holiday, 1989-1990, at Sandringham with her children, her husband, and the rest of the senior royals. And she did what it appeared was her habit of an evening. She got on the phone.
Diana Gate tapes, I believe, in fact, I am certain, were the work of a very deep and sinister dirty tricks department. Nothing will ever persuade me that these tapes came out by accident. I believe the people who did reveal them didn't really know what it was all about.
In 1990, the rift between Charles and Diana was highlighted when he fell off a horse playing polo. The princess was in London when the news reached her that he had broken his arm in 2 places. Diana was in a quandary. She knew she should rush to his side, but it is reported she couldn't be bothered. They were now openly unhappy together, and they chose to spend most of their time apart.
The time Charles had his polo accident, Diana had had time to take stock of the marriage, and she'd gone through a very, very bad period with Charles.
The royal family weren't very much help to Prince Charles in his time of agony and the breakdown of his marriage. His father certainly might have taken some enjoyment from it. His mother was unable to help simply because Charles never asked her.
I primarily blame Charles for not entering the marriage in a modern, acceptable way and not giving his princess the full scope that she should have had in the early years, and reaching a stage where she became not just a competitor, but then an adversary. And really, it was his fault.
Charles is so staid, such a young old fogey set in his ways, that Diana found herself totally reliant on her own devices, on her own friends. She couldn't hold a serious conversation with Charles or his friends. They're all intellectuals.
The business about the Morton book is fascinating, because I don't believe that Andrew, whom I know well, ever set out to write that book. I think he set out with the dream of writing a different kind of book, and suddenly all this material was given to him by acquiescence of those that have now been named as sources, and certainly they would never have done so without the princess's tacit approval.
Did Diana really attempt suicide? Did she try to kill herself 4 or 5 times, as sometimes been claimed? I think not.
After their separation announcement, Charles and Diana had hoped that the pressure on them would ease. It did not. And the most explosive bombshell to hit the royal family was yet to come. His name was James Hewitt. Hewitt had been introduced to Diana at a dinner party in 1985, and sometime shortly after that, they became lovers.
The affair was only fully revealed in the autumn of 1994, when a book was written about Hewitt, largely discredited and certainly disbelieved by Diana's close friends.